What is going on, gunfighters? Today we're going to talk about muzzle loaders. Black powder guns. Here on Gunfighter Life, where we talk about guns, gunfighting, ammunition, all manner of things, the correct way, with God at the center, Judeo-Christian values, and real-world first-hand experience. I am blessed to serve you as host today. I'm going to skip the normal bio. You guys have probably heard it a bunch. This is probably not the first time you've listened. A little bit about the black powder stuff. I have competed in black powder. I've won a few things, I think, in black powder that involve black powder. Used to do the rendezvous, if you know what those are. Like the Mountain Man rendezvous. A lot of fun if they're in your area. You might want to check those out if that's something that might interest you. Also, took my first deer with a muzzle loader when I was very young. Honestly, don't remember, but judging at the pictures, maybe I was 12. My uncle, who did a lot to take me hunting and things like that, and I'm very appreciative, sent me out in the backwoods. I don't even know if they were our woods. I don't even know if I was actually allowed to be hunting there. But I went out and put meat on the table. He gave me a black powder gun, and I went out there, and I took a nice buck for the time. Deer were not nearly as prevalent in the South back then as they are today. I still remember that hunt. I still remember, although I've been blessed to be on many hunts throughout the years, I still remember that one fondly. So why black powder guns on Gunfighter Life? Not a lot of people are gunfighting with black powder today. But it's important to understand, I think, different aspects of guns. There's more to guns than just Glock 19s and AR-15s. It's also important to understand where we came from, right? For a long time, guns were kind of at this plateau where muzzle loading, a black powder musket or handgun, was pretty much it for hundreds of years. I think it's important to know the history. Also, there are some other important aspects. There are some people that might want to get into hunting or protect their families that are good citizens now, but have a felony, who cannot legally own a regular firearm, but they can own a black powder gun. Also, as we'll get into, I think the black powder world has some real merit for a long-term grid-down survival scenario, because you can make your own black powder pretty simply. Anyway, let's explain some terms. Muzzle loader. You load it from the front, from the muzzle, unlike most modern firearms are loaded from the breech. In contrast, the muzzle loader, as the name might suggest, gets loaded from the muzzle. This being perhaps the most basic of firearms. You take a metal tube, a pipe, close it off at one end, you attach it some kind of way to a piece of wood, generally to hold onto it. You stuff it with powder, usually some kind of separation to separate the powder and the projectile, commonly called a wad or a patch. That can literally just be a cloth patch. And you have some kind of way to ignite that black powder. In the very early days, this could have been as simple as a glowing hot piece of metal that you took out of a fire and touched the powder. Or it could have been a smoldering piece of rope, referred to as a match. You may have heard of a matchlock musket. Something as simple as that. And again, musket, no rifling. That invention came much later. Just a smooth bore, like we would think of as a shotgun today. Just a basic metal pipe. For projectiles, you may have even had stone. More commonly later on, lead. A lead ball that is roughly the same size as the diameter of the inside of the tube. Or you could load it with shot. Smaller projectiles. And this is where we were for a long time. Then we had a wheel lock, basically a spinning wheel that created a spark. Then we had the flintlock. This is basically a mechanical device, an arm that's spring-loaded that holds a piece of flint. And as you may know, when flint hits a piece of steel, it creates a spark. That spark, in turn, would ignite a small pan of powder that would hopefully, I say hopefully because it didn't always work, but would hopefully ignite the powder that was inside the main charge. If it didn't, it would just fizzle. That's where we get the term flash in the pan. It's just a flash in the pan. But that was a pretty big leap forward. You didn't have to walk around all day with a smoldering piece of rope, a match, going all the time to have an effective weapon. Right? You could see how that'd be problematic. A flintlock was a big step forward, and this is what you may often think of when you think of the American Revolution. Liberty, freedom, kicking redcoats' butts. Now the redcoats, the British regulars, they were armed with smoothbore muskets. The hardcore American frontiersmen, a lot of our guys were armed with muskets too, but the hardcore guys, the guys we kind of epitomize as rugged American frontiersmen, were sometimes armed with Kentucky, Pennsylvania long rifles because they had rifling. Now, again, there's some debate on how rifling came to be. Some say that it was cut. If you've ever shot black powder, you know that it gets really filthy and leaves a lot of residue to give relief spaces in the barrel to allow that fouling to escape into so you could continue to shoot. I noticed it had a very improved side effect of accuracy. It had gyroscopic stabilization, which is a fancy term just meaning when you spin something through the air, it tends to go in a straight line. That's what rifling is. That's what makes something a rifle opposed to a musket. That rifling, and they had that in the Pennsylvania, Kentucky long rifles. It gave a tremendous amount of range and accuracy advantage over the muskets of the day. Again, in this era, we're still talking about flintlocks. Another cool history term that came out of this, sniper. If you don't know a snipe, it's a small upland game bird with a fairly long beak. You'll find in the eastern woodlands, and they're quite good as food. They fly pretty fast, and they're a small bird, and the people that could shoot those, a sniper. That's where that term sniper comes from, I do believe, if that lure is true. Now, I wasn't around then, so I can't verify that, but that is commonly, I think, accepted as where the term sniper came from. Now, pushing forward, right around the time for our history, Europe, there were some other things going on, but the next big thing for us, in the mid-1800s, just prior to the Civil War, there was another leap forward. The percussion cap. A small compound, I believe, mercury fulminate. I could be wrong. They could have used something else in the early days. But you have that pressure-sensitive explosive in a small cap or copper cup. You put that on what's called a nipple, just a hollow thing that holds the cup. You have that same kind of spring-loaded hammer, but there's really no flint or anything on it. It's just a hammer. And it comes down under spring tension and hits that percussion cap, which creates a spark, which then in turn should light that powder. This was a little bit better system, a little bit more weather resistant if you did it right. And this is what we had largely going into the American Civil War. And even though rifles were a thing, they were a thing in the Revolutionary War, the majority of weapons used on both sides, I believe, were muskets. Still, because it was the technology that was around and proven and cheap to produce and easy to produce. And probably there was a lot more of them at the start of the war. And this is pretty much where black powder stayed up until recent hunting regulations. But if you say black powder rifle today, if you say muzzle loading rifle today, in general, what you're going to get, most common is a Hawkins style rifle. You may find historic Pennsylvania, Kentucky long rifle hunters out there. Most people aren't going to hunt with like a Brown Bess or something. And that's really what's keeping this alive. We're not talking about like reenacting. Talk about black powder rifles today, you're probably talking about a Hawkins style, either flintlock or percussion cap rifle, usually in the 50-ish caliber range, half an inch. Sometimes it's 45 caliber, sometimes it's 54 caliber. There's some other oddballs in there, but those are by far the most common, and I think 50 in my experience is by far the most common. Those may seem like big calibers, again, if you're used to the world of Glock 19s and AR-15s, which is a 22 caliber rifle. The thing about black powder is, well, a couple things. It, unlike smokeless powder, creates a lot of smoke and a lot of residue. Two, it operates at lower pressure. You're not getting the velocity out of that you would get out of smokeless powder. And in general, 45 to 54-ish caliber is a decent size for hunting medium to large game. Say black powder today, that's what we're talking about. You'd have your Hawkins, common ones are CVA, Lyman. Loading and manual of arms is pretty much the same. You pour your powder, pre-measured. A couple of ways you can do this. Traditionally, you'd have like a powder horn and you dump it in a little measuring container, measuring flask, measured by volume, and you would dump that in if you wanted to be more traditional. A patch in a ball or a patch in a minier ball, which is a bullet. A lot of people will call it a mini ball. The guy was French, his name was Minier. It's actually a minier ball, but it looks just like a lead bullet. It was something that came around about the time of the Civil War. Instead of just a round ball, like we talked about, you'd have an actual pointed projectile. Better ballistic coefficient, much better than a round ball. Flies better, straighter, does more damage on target. Generally more mass per given caliber. You're going to take your ramrod, which is usually found under the barrel. You're going to take your ramrod and ram that down. Again, the muzzle, get that seated. You'll usually have a mark on your ramrod to know that it's seated properly. Tamp it down maybe a few times. Then you'll take your priming system, whether that's a flintlock or percussion cap, place your percussion cap on there, cock the hammer, and then fire the weapon. And then repeat. It's a fairly lengthy process. Obviously nowhere near as fast as modern weapons. 3 rounds a minute is commonly referred to as like the standard for a soldier. You can obviously go faster than that or slower than that, but that's a good number to kind of think about this. And that's what you're probably going to talk about if you're talking about traditional hunting with black powder. Hawkins rifle, pretty brass inlays, a lot of times a hexagonal barrel. You'll see that because that was traditional at the time, because as I understand it, that's how barrel steel came in that shape. It was just how they manufactured it. It's cheaper and easier to keep it in that hexagon pattern. It costs more to round the edges to make it a round, smooth barrel. Sometimes you'll see half and half. But today it's actually the opposite. Today I think it's easier to have round barrels and it costs a little bit more to get the hexagonal barrel, but a lot of people like it because of the historicity and the way it looks. But that's commonly what you think of when you think of black powder. The handguns prior to black powder revolvers were much the same way. They were just a handgun, but they worked the same way. You dumped the powder, you took your patched round ball, other projectile, you rammed it down in there. With your ramrod, you put your priming percussion cap or something else in steel, you cocked the hammer back, and that was your handgun. Basically worked exactly the same, just smaller. When we get into the world of black powder revolvers, which are still fairly common today, they're just a lot of fun. This was our first real practical, usable in the field, repeating firepower. You'll find these also in the mid-1800s. They were used in the Civil War. They were fairly expensive. Were by far not a mass issue thing. Things like the Lee Navy, the Old Army, things like this, the LeMat. Really, honestly, the first field usable, repeatable firepower. There were some lever actions coming, but the revolver kind of predates that. As the name suggests, you just have a revolving cylinder, just like revolvers today, but except being loaded with metallic cartridges. Loaded much the same way, except you would load each cylinder. You would have a little contraption on the front. It would do the same thing. You would put the powder in. You would use that kind of lever to push the patched round ball. Maybe later the actual bullet-shaped projectile, sometimes like a wax patch, down in there. And each cylinder would have a nipple that you put a percussion cap on. Or revolvers for like flintlocks that go way back in Europe. But again, I don't think they were very practical in the field. These were actually practical in the field. Even in adverse weather and stuff, you had repeatable firepower for like cavalry, for somebody storming your line in the Civil War, for close combat. Repeatable firepower. But black powder revolvers. They're still a thing today. They're still common today. And they're still pretty potent. Don't underestimate them. And they can be quite accurate if you know how to load them. There's a lot more that goes into that than just going to the range and throwing a metallic cased modern round into a revolver. But they can be quite adequate. If you are a good citizen now, you've paid your debt to society, but you still had your Second Amendment rights taken away, those don't count as a firearm. Even make cartridge conversion cylinders for those. That's all I'm going to say about that. But touching on the black powder there. Now getting into the modern black powder muzzle loaders. These are kind of this in name only. They are a way to kind of circumvent and be able to hunt in a season where you can't hunt with a regular gun. But they're very much a modern thing. A lot of times they have pre-measured charged pellets of not even black powder but Pyrodex. It's basically just a modern kind of smokeless version that has similar pressures to black powder. I want to shoot a lot of this. Pyrodex actually is good because it's not as corrosive, it's not as nasty, it burns cleaner. But they'll generally use pre-measured pellets or charges of Pyrodex. Generally won't even use a percussion cap. They will use a shotgun primer. You'll generally have a sabot projectile. You'll have a sub-caliber projectile with some kind of, usually polymer, thing encapsulating it, letting you get higher velocity, smaller projectile than you would for a given caliber. Very much a modern thing, but can give you some added range and effectiveness if you're looking to stretch the legs of a black powder muzzleloader for modern hunting, deer or elk or whatever. In a given season, they're generally referred to as inline muzzleloaders. Inline muzzleloaders generally have that exposed hammer. Everything's in a straight line. Generally use a shotgun primer, pre-measured pellets. If you care nothing about the history, you care nothing about the tradition, you just want to go put as many deer in the freezer legally as possible, a lot of states have these muzzle loading seasons, and technically you still load it from the muzzle, so technically it's still a muzzle loader, and that's where you see those. Just real quick, men, if you hear a little bit of audio feedback, that's my bad. I did something to damage the microphone cable, and I'm trying to be careful with it. I've recorded sections of this several times, but until I get a new cable for the Blue Snowball mic, you may hear a little bit of feedback. I'm trying to minimize it and re-record where it's really bad, but if you hear a little bit, hopefully soon that'll be rectified. Let's talk about black powder shotguns. These are kind of around mostly for fun and people that like the history. Dedicated black powder shotguns. Commonly also side-by-sides. Again, if you're talking about the old muskets, a lot of these were 60-some, 70-some caliber. 68 was a real common caliber. That's pretty analogous to 20-gauge, 12-gauge shotguns. Again, you could load them with one big round ball, much like you load a slug today, or you could load them with shot, making it a shotgun. The difference was not as bifurcated as it is today in shotguns and rifles, until we got rifling. Kind of makes sense, right? But there were dedicated black powder shotguns. There were some side-by-sides. You pretty much do the same thing. Dump the powder. You'd have some kind of shot cup or wad. You'd put the shot down there, and you generally have what's called an overshot wad. Keep the shot from coming out of the barrel prematurely. And you would generally have 2 percussion caps or 2 flints for your flintlocks on each side of the side-by-side shotgun. Those are still a thing. I'm not aware of anywhere that actually has like a black powder season for birds or something like that. That would be really cool. I'm not aware that that exists. But black powder shotguns are also a thing. Now, let's talk about the end of the world as we know it. Black powder guns for survival. This is something that's not often talked about. But where I'm going to start is a lot of modern calibers we have today actually started in black powder eras, meaning they were originally loaded with black powder. The 45 long Colt or 45 Colt, that's a black powder round. As I alluded to, you can absolutely make your own black powder. It's a few very simple elements. They're not hard to find. They're not hard to make. I remember accounts of like pioneers going out on long hunts and making their own in the field. It is not rocket science. It's pretty basic stuff. They made it in the, eastern woodlands in the 1700s. You can make it today. And if you have one of these firearms, let's say you have a modern revolver M45 Colt or 38 Special, you absolutely can load those with black powder. Not going to be as good, it's going to be a little bit dirtier, but it should absolutely work. You can also make your own priming compounds very simply. And you can reuse primers. You can take a small punch that's about the same size as a small or large pistol primer, or rifle primer for that matter, flatten it back out and fill it with priming compound. I'm not going to tell you the exact formulas and stuff. That may be illegal, it may be totally fine, but either way it will make the podcast pretty dry. It's not hard to research and find out how to make your own stuff. If things got really bad, and this would take a while, but I was just listening to a thing yesterday on the fall of the Roman Empire and Britannia going to Britain. They had, hot and cold running water. They had literacy. They had all kinds of culture and things. And then when the Dark Ages came, they lost that. Lost basic sanitation. They lost, for the most part, reading and writing for a long time. They didn't have hot and cold running water again largely until, Industrial Revolution. You're talking hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. Don't think that things can't get that bad. Civilizations fall all the time. You could load many of these modern guns that were around in this era with black powder. Semi-autos, probably not, because you require a certain amount of pressure to cycle the action. But things like a lever action 45 long Colt, or a revolver M45 long Colt, there's absolutely no reason you couldn't reload those as long as you were judicious about cleaning them and getting black powder residue out, and use those, making your own black powder. Also, shotguns, we talked about those. The original shotgun shells, like 12-gauge shells, old 12-gauge shells, were loaded with black powder. They were paper shells loaded with black powder. You absolutely can reload shotgun shells. You absolutely can reload them with black powder. The cool thing about the shotgun is you can cast your own bullets. Grew up casting lead. You certainly can make your own bullets. You should probably have a bullet mold if you're thinking about doing this. The shotgun's a lot more forgiving. In general, how you make shot is you drop it from a high distance. You drop lead through some kind of screen when it's molten. This is how they still make it, I believe. When it's falling through the air, it forms a sphere because it's attracted to itself. Mass attracts mass. That's how gravity works. It forms these spheres, and you drop it into water, and it cools, and there's your shot. Do it in any size you want. You could do it in buckshot. You could do it in birdshot, and load it with black powder. You could do that for survival. You could also get a dedicated, black powder revolver, or a dedicated one of those what we talked about, Hawkins rifles. If you wanted to keep your good ammo, still wanted your Glock 19 for defense. Keep it for defense. But when you're going out hunting, you don't want to waste that precious ammo. Again, you can make your own black powder. If it's a flintlock, you can find rocks. It doesn't actually have to be flint. In fact, most stuff in North America is not flint. It's just referred to as flint. I'm not a geologist, but I know enough to know that. But any rock that's hard enough can generally make a spark when it strikes steel. If you can get a piece of rock like that, and you can make your own black powder, you pretty much have an infinite ammo supply. You don't have to worry about wasting your good 9mm or your good 308 ammo if you're going out in the back 40 to hunt deer. People have been killing deer with a muzzleloader for a long time. You can still do it. You can do it post-collapse, and you wouldn't have to eat into your ammo supply. Also, what I think would be a really cool option is one of those old double-barrel side-by-side, hammer-fired, muzzle-loading shotguns. They make new versions of it, or modern versions of it. Even make might be in this scenario, the Howdah pistols in 20-gauge black powder. Anyway, really cool options, often not talked about in the survival circles. Even if nothing ever collapses, even if the debt ceiling keeps going up and up and up, inflation stops, and the world keeps turning through hundreds of more years, just fine. They're a lot of fun. Going out and shooting black powder is a lot of fun. I used to really like doing the Mountain Man rendezvous. I really like hunting with black powder, and not like the inline that are basically a single shot modern contraption, like the old Hawkins style. They're just really cool, and they're a lot of fun. There's a lot of reasons to like black powder, and even if not, hopefully you learn something in the history side of how we kind of got to where we are today. Hopefully an interesting episode, even if you decide you never want to own a black powder weapon. Anyway, with that, if you like this episode, if you like the podcast, hopefully you'll consider supporting. A couple of ways you can do that. make sure you're liked and subscribed. Share it with a friend. If you're like, hey, old Jimbo, he's into black powder, I'm going to share this episode with him. Maybe there's something in there he hasn't thought about. Or whatever, any example, anything I've talked about. Feel free to share it. If you have never left a review, consider scrolling down and leaving a review of the podcast. I don't know how, but apparently somehow in some kind of algorithm it helps the podcast get noticed. The whole point of the podcast is to get the information out there to people that can use it. I'm here to serve in that way. So, leave a review. If you really want to support, consider becoming a patron. There should be a Patreon link in the show notes. With that, your tactical tip of the day. On muzzle loaders, on cleaning, and you can use this for firearms that are really dirty, but a good way to clean muzzle loaders and that black powder residue is hot soapy water. Yep, hot soapy water. Cleaning the gun with hot soapy water, make sure you dry it out, but that's a real common way to clean black powder. It's a real common way you can clean lots of guns. You can disassemble your Glock, completely disassemble it. If it's really nasty after like a competition, clean it with hot soapy water, make sure it's dry before you lube it and put it back together. It's a good way to clean all kinds of guns, but hot soapy water. Another thing commonly referred to as moose milk. You can generally make this with ballistol and water. You mix it together. It's a real good way to clean really nasty and lots of residue out of the bore of a firearm. Moose milk. Also, something that the guys did that were really good in this, and I adopted because, respect your elders. They kind of seem to know what they were talking about. I've never done an empirical side-by-side study, but they would often add cream of wheat to their black powder so you could shoot more. Apparently it cleaned a little bit as you shot. So that's something you may want to look into. A couple of tactical tips there on black powder. Tactical verse of the day. From Genesis chapter 9. Then God blessed Noah and his sons and said to them, be fruitful and multiply, and fill the earth, and the fear of you and the terror of you will be on every animal of the earth, and on every bird of the sky, on everything that crawls on the ground, and on all the fish of the sea. They are handed over to you. Every moving thing that is alive shall be food for you. I have given everything to you, as I have given the green plant. But you shall not eat flesh with its life, that is, its blood. I certainly will require your lifeblood. For every animal I will require it. And from every person, from every man as his brother, I will require the life of a person. Whoever sheds human blood, by man, his blood shall be shed. For in the image of God he made mankind. As for you, be fruitful and multiply. Populate the earth abundantly and multiply in it. You're called to have dominion, to rule over. Commentary. God made you different, special, in his very own image. Get out there, be a man, have dominion, be in control. With that, thanks for listening and have a blessed day.